Name of the story: The Return of the Twins. Maggie sat at the edge of her bed, the dim light from the lamp casting long shadows across her room. The faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen was the only sound that broke the silence of the house. She had always been a light sleeper, even before the accident. Before everything had changed, her eyes drifted to the photo on her nightstand, the one of her two children, Emma and Luke, laughing as they stood in front of a playground, arms wrapped around each other. It felt like a lifetime ago. Their smiles were frozen in time, an echo of happiness she could no longer reach. She had lost them both that fateful night in the most inexplicable way. And since then, the nightmares had come, always the same, always haunting her. But lately the dreams had changed. It had started 2 weeks ago, a whisper in the dark, a flicker at the corner of her vision. At first, Maggie had convinced herself it was just a side effect of her grief, an echo of memories that refused to die. But these dreams felt different. These dreams felt real. In the darkness, she could hear them, small footsteps, the gentle padding of children's feet moving closer. She would turn her head, and there they would be, two children, identical in every way. Their faces, pale and serene, locked in a gaze that seemed to reach into her very soul. "Maggie," one of them whispered, the voice sweet and innocent, but laced with something unsettling. "Maggie, we're here." She could feel her heart skip a beat. She knew their voices. She knew those faces. It was Emma and Luke, but older now. They stood before her, yet something about them was off. Their eyes, those dark, endless eyes, seemed to glimmer with something she couldn't place, something that made her skin crawl. In every dream, they would stand there, just watching her, until she could no longer bear the silence. "Why are you here?" she would ask, the words trembling in her throat. You're gone. You're not real." They would smile then, their expressions soft, reassuring, but still there was something wrong. The smile never reached their eyes. "We're not gone, Mommy," they would reply in unison. "We've come back." And then, just like that, they would vanish into the darkness, leaving Maggie with only the echo of their voices. At first, she had tried to ignore the dreams, chalking them up to the lingering trauma of losing her children. But as the nights wore on, the dreams grew more intense. The twins seemed to come closer each time, their touch colder, their voices more insistent. She could feel them lingering in the corners of her life, even when she wasn't asleep. One evening, after another restless night, Maggie decided to take action. She stood in front of the mirror in her living room, her fingers brushing the edges of her hair, her reflection staring back at her with hollow eyes. She looked tired, thinner than she should be, and her skin was pale from the lack of sleep. The dreams had started to take their toll. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered to her reflection. "Why now? Why me?" As she stared at her image, her mind wandered back to the accident. It was an ordinary evening. Her children had been playing outside, laughing and shouting as they ran through the yard. She had been inside, preparing dinner, when the crash happened. A car swerved off the road, out of control, and struck them both. The memories were still so vivid. She could hear the sirens, see the flashing lights. But the worst part was the look on their faces, the terror in their eyes as they... Maggie shook her head, trying to push the thought away. It was too painful. But no matter how much she tried, the memories refused to leave. And now, in her dreams, they had returned. That night, Maggie fell into another restless sleep. The darkness of her bedroom seemed to stretch for miles, oppressive and thick. She closed her eyes, hoping for a few hours of peace. But it didn't come. "Maggie!" The whisper broke through her consciousness like a blade, sharp and insistent. She opened her eyes, heart racing, but the room was empty. There was no sound except for the faint creaking of the house settling. She lay still, trying to ignore the rising panic in her chest. Then, from the shadows, they appeared. Emma and Luke, identical as always, standing at the foot of her bed. Their eyes gleamed in the dim light, cold and distant, but still somehow familiar. "Why do you keep coming to me?" Maggie asked, her voice shaking with emotion. "Why won't you leave me alone?" They didn't respond immediately. Instead, they just stared at her, their faces calm, almost serene. But the silence was worse than any answer they could have given. It was as if they were watching her, waiting for her to break, to give in to whatever strange force held them there. "Mommy," Luke's voice was soft, almost too soft. "Don't you remember? You promised." Maggie's heart skipped a beat. "Promised? What was he talking about?" "You promised you'd bring us back," Emma added, her voice strangely calm, almost like a lullaby. The words hit Maggie like a physical blow. She felt dizzy, her vision blurring. She didn't understand. She had never made any promise. "Bring you back," she gasped, struggling to sit up. I didn't." "You promised, Mommy," Luke said again, his eyes now dark and endless, a void that seemed to swallow everything in their gaze. "You promised." Suddenly, Maggie felt a cold hand on her arm. She recoiled, but when she looked, no one was there. The pressure remained, though, a lingering chill that crawled under her skin. She gasped for breath, her mind racing. It felt like the room was closing in on her, like the walls themselves were pressing down, suffocating her. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "This isn't real. You're not real. You can't be." The children didn't speak anymore. Instead, they just stood there, staring at her. Their faces had taken on a different quality now, an expression of pity, as though they understood something she couldn't. Something she wasn't meant to know. "Maggie," the voice came again, but it was softer now, more distant, as if carried by the wind. The pressure on her arm grew stronger, and she struggled against it, but it was no use. Her limbs felt heavy, as though she were sinking into the bed itself, being swallowed whole. The children were still watching her, but there was something different in their eyes now. Something more knowing, more dangerous. And as the room grew colder still, Maggie realized this wasn't a dream. Not anymore. This was something else. The darkness in her room thickened, almost as if the shadows themselves had a life of their own, curling around her and whispering in ways she could never quite understand. Maggie tried to shake the cold hand from her arm, but it was like it was made of ice, unyielding and forceful. The children, Emma and Luke, were still standing there, their eyes piercing into her soul, and no matter how much she tried to convince herself it was just another nightmare, she could feel the terror creeping up her spine. "Maggie!" The voice called again, now far away but somehow still so close, vibrating within her chest, as if it were coming from inside her own mind. Her breath caught in her throat. She could see their lips move in unison, as if rehearsed. "Please, Mommy." Emma's voice sounded just as it always had when she was a child, innocent and pleading. "Don't you want us back? We've waited so long. Don't you miss us?" Maggie squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block the words out, but they echoed in her ears, growing louder and louder. "No, no," she shouted, but her voice felt like it was being smothered by the cold air, as though the house itself was swallowing her words. But the children did not flinch. They simply stood there, unwavering, as though they had all the time in the world to wait for her to realize something. "Maggie," Luke's voice now took on a darker tone. It wasn't the soft, childlike sound from before. It was heavy, almost accusatory. "Why did you leave us, Mommy? Why did you let us go?" Her eyes snapped open, and the room seemed to tilt, spinning wildly as she tried to orient herself. The cold hand was still on her arm, but it felt less like a hand now, and more like the suffocating pressure of something far more ancient, far more sinister. Her heart pounded painfully in her chest as she finally spoke, her voice hoarse, raw with emotion. "I didn't leave you. Her breath hitched. "I couldn't save you. You were taken from me." The children's gaze softened, but there was still something unsettling about them, something wrong. They weren't just her children anymore. Their faces, though familiar, were warped by something she couldn't understand, something darker than grief. "Then why are you here, Mommy?" Emma asked, her voice so gentle it felt like a mockery. "If you couldn't save us, what makes you think you can save yourself now?" Maggie's stomach lurched. The words cut deeper than any knife, and for a moment, she felt an overwhelming wave of guilt crashing over her, drowning her in self-loathing. She knew she couldn't save them. She had tried, but the accident, the randomness of it, had stolen them from her in a way that defied comprehension. There was no way to bring them back. There was no way to change what had happened. But now they were back. Her pulse quickened as the air grew thicker. The pressure in the room intensified, and the faint light from the lamp flickered, casting distorted shadows on the walls. Maggie felt a chill crawl up her spine as the twins inched closer, their small feet making no sound on the floor. The oppressive silence was unbearable. The tension in the room thickened, wrapping itself around her, tightening like a noose. "Why don't you leave me alone?" Maggie whispered, her voice trembling with fear and anger. She wanted to scream, to wake herself up, but the words caught in her throat, like they had all been taken away with the dream. But the children just stood there, eyes unblinking, faces unreadable. "Because you promised," Luke said again, his voice soft and low. "You promised us you would bring us back." Maggie's pulse raced. What was this? What did they mean? "I never promised you anything," she cried out, shaking her head violently, as though to deny their words. "You're not real. You're not real." Emma's face darkened, and for the first time, Maggie saw a flicker of something far more sinister in her expression. "We're as real as you are, Mommy. We are as real as you allow us to be." The room seemed to close in on Maggie as she struggled against the unseen grip that held her. The children stepped forward, their faces impossibly close now, their breath cold against her skin. "Do you remember the night we left?" Luke's voice was soft, almost too soft, and Maggie could feel the hairs on her neck rise. "Do you remember how you couldn't save us? How you stood there frozen while we—" Maggie's head swam. The pain from that night, the horror, the helplessness was too much to bear. She didn't want to remember. She couldn't. She squeezed her eyes shut, pressing her palms to her temples, but the images were already there, replaying in her mind, playing on a loop she couldn't stop. The screeching tires, the shattering glass, the sound of her children's screams as they were torn from her life in an instant. She had stood there, helpless, frozen in shock, as the world she had known collapsed around her. And in that moment she knew. She knew she would never be the same. She had lost them. "Why couldn't you save us, Mommy?" Emma's voice came again, sharp and cutting, a question that sliced through the layers of time and pain. Maggie opened her eyes, and for a moment she saw them, her children. But they were no longer just children. The air around them seemed to distort, darken. Their faces had changed, their eyes no longer filled with innocence, but with something much older, something far more unsettling. They were the same, but they weren't. And it was in that moment that Maggie realized these weren't her children. Not anymore. These were something else. "What are you?" she gasped, her voice barely audible, choked with fear. The twins didn't answer right away. Instead, they took another step closer, their expressions unreadable, but there was something in their eyes now that sent a chill through Maggie's entire body. "You promised us," Luke said, his voice now a whisper that seemed to echo all around her. "You promised you would bring us back, Mommy. And now we've come to collect." Maggie's heart pounded in her chest as she stared into their eyes. She could feel the weight of their presence, an invisible pressure in the air, pushing down on her. They were standing so close now, their faces mere inches from hers, and she could see the strange, unsettling glow in their eyes, like something was trapped behind them, something that wasn't human. "Why now?" Maggie whispered, her voice cracking with dread. "Why are you doing this to me?" Emma's lips curled into a smile, and it was then that Maggie realized something far more terrifying than anything she had yet considered. The twins were not just ghosts. They were not just figments of her imagination or twisted echoes of grief. They were something far darker, something that had returned with a purpose. And that purpose was her. "We didn't come to punish you, Mommy." Emma's voice was low and soft. "We came to bring you home." Maggie's world tilted once again, the room spinning as if she were caught in a vortex. And with that, she understood. She wasn't just seeing her children in her dreams. She wasn't just haunted by memories. The twins had returned for a reason, and that reason was something she couldn't run from. Maggie stumbled backward, her legs giving way as she collapsed onto the edge of the bed. The twins loomed over her, their figures unnaturally still, as though they were suspended in time. The glow in their eyes flickered faintly, casting an eerie light across their pale faces. Her breathing came in short, ragged gasps, and her mind raced for answers she couldn't find. What do you mean?" she stammered, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Bring me home? This is my home. This is where I—" "No," Luke interrupted, his voice colder now, devoid of the childlike warmth it had once carried. "This isn't your home. Not anymore." Emma stepped forward, her small hand reaching out toward Maggie. Though the gesture seemed innocent, Maggie recoiled instinctively, pressing herself against the headboard. The air in the room grew heavier, pressing against her chest like a lead weight. "You belong with us," Emma said softly, her tone unnervingly calm. "You promised, Mommy. You promised we'd be together forever." Maggie's throat tightened, and she shook her head violently. "I don't understand," she cried, her voice cracking under the weight of her fear. "I never promised anything. I never wanted this." Emma's smile faltered, and her head tilted to one side, her expression shifting to one of disappointment. "You don't remember, do you?" she asked quietly, her voice tinged with a sadness that didn't feel entirely genuine. "You don't remember what you said that night?" Maggie froze. Her mind churned, dredging up fragments of memory she had buried deep within herself. The night of the accident was a blur of chaos and despair, but she could vaguely recall sitting in the hospital waiting room, her hands clasped together in a white-knuckled grip. She had prayed, begged, pleaded for a miracle, her voice trembling as she made promises to a silent, indifferent universe. "Take me instead," she had whispered through her tears, her voice cracking with desperation. "Please just let them live. I'll do anything to have them back." Her stomach lurched as the memory came flooding back, clear and undeniable. She had made a promise, not to her children, but to something else, something that had been listening in the darkness, waiting for the right moment to collect its due. "No," Maggie whispered, shaking her head as tears welled in her eyes. "No, that wasn't real. It wasn't real." Emma's smile returned, this time wider, more unsettling. "It was real, Mommy," she said, her voice dripping with satisfaction. "And we've waited so long for you to remember." Luke stepped closer now, his small hand brushing against Maggie's arm. The touch sent a jolt of icy pain through her body, and she cried out, clutching her arm as though she had been burned. "You called to us," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "You asked for us to come back, and now we're here." Maggie's tears streamed freely down her face as she clutched her head in her hands, her mind spiraling into chaos. She couldn't believe it, She refused to believe it. The twins were gone. They had been taken from her in an instant, and no amount of desperate pleading could bring them back. And yet, here they were, standing before her, their presence undeniable and suffocating. "I didn't mean it," she choked out, her voice barely audible. "I didn't know. I didn't know this would happen." Luke's expression darkened, and his voice dropped to a chilling whisper. "It doesn't matter what you meant. A promise is a promise, Mommy." Maggie's breath hitched as the temperature in the room plummeted. Frost began to creep along the edges of the window, spreading like veins across the glass. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch and writhe, taking on shapes that defied logic. She felt the bed beneath her tremble, and the walls seemed to close in, as though the house itself was reacting to the twins' presence. "I can't," Maggie whispered, her voice trembling with fear and despair. "I can't go with you. I can't do this." Emma's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, Maggie saw anger flicker across her face. "You don't have a choice," she said coldly. "You made a promise, and promises can't be broken." The room seemed to warp around Maggie, the walls twisting and distorting as the shadows grew darker, deeper. She felt as though she were being pulled into a void, an endless chasm that threatened to consume her entirely. The twins stood over her, their faces now devoid of any emotion, their eyes like bottomless pits. "We waited for you," Luke said, his voice echoing in the dark. "We waited so long. And now it's time." Maggie's heart raced as the shadows crept closer, swallowing the light from the lamp and plunging the room into an oppressive darkness. She could feel the cold seeping into her bones, a chill that seemed to originate from within her own soul. "No," she screamed, her voice raw with desperation. "I won't go with you. You're not my children. You're not real." Emma and Luke exchanged a glance, and their expressions shifted once again. This time they smiled, not the innocent, childlike smile she had once known, but something darker, something predatory. "Oh, we're real, Mommy," Emma said, her voice carrying an edge of malice. "And soon, you'll see just how real we are." Before Maggie could react, the darkness surged forward, enveloping her completely. She felt herself falling, spiraling into a void of cold and silence, her screams swallowed by the oppressive blackness. And as she fell, she heard their voices, faint and distant, echoing in the void. "You promised, Mommy. And now we're taking you home." Maggie opened her eyes to a suffocating darkness, so dense and absolute it felt as though it had a weight of its own. She struggled to breathe, gasping for air that seemed thick and damp, her lungs straining with every shallow inhalation. The cold was relentless, a piercing chill that seeped into her very core. For a moment, she couldn't tell if she was awake or still trapped in a nightmare. And then faintly she heard it, a sound like soft whispers echoing around her. The voices were low and indistinct, overlapping one another, their tones neither friendly nor entirely hostile. They seemed to come from everywhere at once, encircling her in an unseen presence. Maggie tried to move, but her body felt sluggish, as though it were being held down by an invisible force. Panic surged through her as she clawed at the ground beneath her. It felt cold and gritty, like damp soil, and the scent of earth and decay filled her nostrils. She shivered, realizing that wherever she was, it was not her bedroom. "Where am I?" she croaked, her voice hoarse and trembling. The whispers ceased abruptly, plunging her into an eerie silence that made her heart race even faster. The air felt heavy, oppressive, and she could hear her own pulse pounding in her ears. A flicker of light appeared in the distance, faint and wavering, like the glow of a single candle. Maggie's eyes fixed on it, her desperation for any sense of direction overpowering her fear. Slowly, she pushed herself onto her hands and knees, her movements stiff and hesitant. The light seemed impossibly far, but it was the only thing breaking the suffocating darkness. She had no choice but to follow it. As she crawled toward the light, the whispers resumed, louder this time. The voices were clearer now, though their words still eluded her comprehension. They sounded like fragments of conversations, overlapping and disjointed, spoken by countless mouths. "She's here. She belongs to us now. Why did she take so long?" Maggie's heart pounded as she forced herself to her feet, her legs trembling beneath her. The light grew brighter, illuminating her surroundings. She gasped as she realized she was in a forest. The trees loomed impossibly tall, their gnarled branches twisting like skeletal hands against a starless sky. The ground beneath her was soft and wet, and the air was thick with the smell of damp earth and rotting leaves. The whispers followed her, weaving between the trees like unseen specters. She stumbled forward, her eyes locked on the light ahead. It flickered erratically, casting strange, shifting shadows that danced along the forest floor. With every step she took, the light seemed to grow farther away, as though it were deliberately leading her deeper into the woods. "Stop!" Maggie cried, her voice cracking with desperation. "Please, just stop. I don't know what you want from me." The whispers grew louder, rising to a cacophony of overlapping voices. She covered her ears, but it did nothing to block out the sound. It was inside her head, invading her thoughts and drowning out her own voice. "You promised. You can't leave us now. Come with us." The voices shifted, taking on a more familiar tone. Maggie froze as she heard Emma's voice, soft and pleading. "Mommy, don't leave us again. Please." Her breath caught in her throat. She turned, her eyes darting through the darkness. "Emma? Luke?" She called out, her voice shaking. "Where are you?" A giggle echoed through the trees, high-pitched and childlike. It was followed by the sound of footsteps, small and quick, rustling through the leaves. Maggie's heart raced as she turned in circles, searching for the source of the sound. "Mommy!" Luke's voice came from somewhere behind her, low and teasing. "We're waiting." Maggie spun around, but there was nothing there, just the endless, oppressive forest and the flickering light in the distance. "Stop it!" she shouted, her voice cracking. "This isn't funny. Just stop." Another giggle, closer this time. She felt a rush of cold air against her neck, like the whisper of a breath. She whirled around, and for a brief moment she thought she saw them, Emma and Luke, standing just beyond the edge of the light. But their faces were obscured, their features blurred like a half-remembered dream. "Why won't you come with us, Mommy?" Emma asked, her voice tinged with sadness. "Don't you want to be a family again?" Maggie's hands trembled as she took a step back, her instincts screaming at her to run. "You're not my children," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You're not real." Emma and Luke tilted their heads in unison, their movements unnaturally synchronized. "We are real," Luke said, his tone chillingly calm. "We're more real than you think." The light ahead flickered violently, growing brighter and then dimming again, as though it were struggling to stay alive. The forest around her seemed to shift and warp, the trees leaning in closer, their branches clawing at the air. Maggie stumbled backward, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "You can't escape us, Mommy," Emma said, her voice echoing through the darkness. "You promised." Maggie turned and ran, her feet pounding against the soft, uneven ground. The forest closed in around her, the trees twisting and writhing like living things. The whispers grew louder, chasing her, surrounding her, until she couldn't tell where they were coming from. Her lungs burned, her legs ached, but she kept running, driven by sheer terror. The light flickered ahead, closer now, almost within reach. She stretched out her hand, desperate to touch it, to find some solace in its warmth. But just as she reached the light, it vanished. Maggie skidded to a stop, her chest heaving as she stared into the darkness. The whispers fell silent, and for a moment there was nothing but the sound of her own ragged breathing. Then she heard it, a low, guttural growl, deep and primal. It came from behind her, so close she could feel the vibration in her chest. She turned slowly, her heart pounding like a drum. Standing in the darkness was a figure, tall and shadowy, its form shifting and indistinct. Its eyes glowed faintly, twin orbs of pale light that seemed to pierce through her. Maggie took a step back, her entire body trembling. What are you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The figure didn't respond. It simply stood there, watching her, its presence radiating a palpable sense of malice. And then slowly it began to move toward her. Maggie stumbled backward, her limbs trembling as the shadowy figure advanced toward her. Its movements were slow but deliberate, as though it relished her terror. The pale glow of its eyes cut through the oppressive darkness, locking her in place with a gaze that felt both accusatory and predatory. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. Her voice was trapped in her throat, suffocated by the icy dread that gripped her. The forest around her seemed to shudder in response to the figure's presence, the branches of the trees creaking as though they too recoiled from its approach. "Why are you doing this to me?" Maggie finally managed to choke out, her voice hoarse and desperate. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen." The figure stopped, its head tilting slightly as though considering her words. Its form began to shift, the darkness that composed it swirling like smoke. Slowly, it took on a more solid shape, a shape that made Maggie's breath catch in her throat. It was Emma, or at least it looked like Emma. The figure bore her daughter's face, but something was wrong. The features were too sharp, the smile too wide, the eyes too cold. It was as though someone had taken her daughter's likeness and twisted it into something grotesque. "You made us a promise," the figure said, its voice a perfect mimicry of Emma's, though layered with a sinister undertone. "You said you'd do anything to bring us back. And now you want to run?" Maggie shook her head violently, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't know," she cried. "I didn't know this would happen. Please, I just wanted you to be safe. I wanted you to be happy." The figure's smile widened, and it took another step closer. "Happy," it echoed, its tone dripping with mockery. "You think we're happy, Mommy? Do you know what it's like where we were? Do you know what you brought us back from?" Maggie's knees buckled, and she collapsed to the ground, her hands clutching at the damp soil. "I didn't know," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I didn't know." The figure crouched in front of her, its face inches from hers. Its breath was cold, carrying a scent of decay that made her stomach turn. "But you do now," it said, its voice soft and menacing. "And it's too late to take it back." Behind the figure, another shape began to emerge from the darkness. Maggie's heart sank as she recognized Luke's form, his features just as distorted as Emma's. He stood silently, his glowing eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "You can't leave us, Mommy," Luke said, his voice low and steady. "You promised we'd be together forever." Maggie shook her head, her tears falling freely. "I didn't mean it," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I didn't mean it like this." Emma's figure straightened, towering over her. "It doesn't matter what you meant," she said coldly. "You made a choice. And choices have consequences." The ground beneath Maggie began to shift, the soil softening as though it had turned to mud. She looked down in horror as her hands sank into the earth, the cold, wet ground sucking at her fingers. The whispers returned, louder now, swirling around her like a tempest. "Take her. She belongs with us now. She promised." The forest seemed to close in around her, the trees leaning inward as their branches reached toward her like skeletal hands. Maggie thrashed, trying to free herself from the grasp of the earth. But the harder she struggled, the deeper she sank. "Please," she screamed, her voice breaking with desperation. "I don't want this. I don't want to go with you." Emma and Luke watched her struggle, their expressions cold and unfeeling. "It's not about what you want," Emma said, her voice sharp and final. "It's about what you owe." The ground swallowed Maggie up to her waist, the mud clinging to her like a living thing. Her arms flailed as she tried to pull herself free, but it was no use. The forest around her seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, the whispers rising to a deafening crescendo. And then, just as she thought she would be consumed entirely, everything stopped. The whispers fell silent. The forest grew still. The mud holding her in place released its grip, and Maggie fell forward, gasping for air. She clawed at the ground, dragging herself out of the pit that had nearly claimed her. When she looked up, Emma and Luke were gone. The light had returned, flickering faintly in the distance, but it felt different now, dimmer, weaker. The oppressive weight in the air had lifted slightly, though the cold remained. Maggie staggered to her feet, her body trembling with exhaustion. She didn't know what had just happened or why she had been spared, but she knew she couldn't stay here. She turned toward the light, her only guide in this nightmare, and began to walk. The whispers were gone, but a single voice lingered in her mind, soft and haunting. "You can't run forever, Mommy. We'll find you." Maggie quickened her pace, the light growing brighter with each step. But no matter how far she walked, the forest stretched endlessly before her, and the feeling of being watched never truly left her. The light seemed close enough to touch now, its faint glow casting long shadows on the gnarled trees around her. Maggie's steps quickened, driven by desperation and the faint hope that it might lead her out of this nightmare. Her legs ached, her breath came in ragged gasps, but she didn't dare stop. Behind her, the forest was unnervingly quiet, the stillness more unsettling than the whispers had been. She reached the source of the light and stopped, her heart sinking as she realized what it was. A small lantern hung from a low branch, its glass cracked and smudged, the flame inside flickering weakly. Beneath it, the ground had been cleared of leaves and debris, revealing a strange pattern carved into the soil. It was a circle filled with symbols Maggie didn't recognize, their jagged lines intersecting in ways that made her eyes ache to look at them. "What is this?" she whispered, her voice trembling. She reached out to touch the lantern, hoping it might provide some warmth or guidance, but as her fingers brushed against the glass, the flame flared violently, casting the forest in a stark, flickering light. Maggie stumbled back, shielding her eyes as shadows danced wildly around her. A voice rang out, deep and resonant, cutting through the stillness like a knife. "You shouldn't have come here." Maggie spun around, her eyes darting through the trees. The voice was unfamiliar, its tone stern but not immediately threatening. "Who's there?" she called, her voice shaking. "Please, I need help. I don't know where I am." The forest remained silent for a moment, and then a figure stepped into the light. It was a man, tall and wiry, with a weathered face that spoke of years spent battling the elements. His clothes were simple, a dark coat and boots caked with mud, and his piercing gray eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that made her shiver. "You shouldn't have followed the light," he said, his voice low and steady. "It's not meant for the living." Maggie's knees wobbled as the weight of his words sank in. "What do you mean?" she stammered. "I didn't have a choice. I was lost, and it was the only thing I could see." The man's expression softened slightly, but his eyes remained wary. "Lost, are you? That's how it starts for most of them. The forest calls to the broken, the grieving. It knows your pain, and it uses it to lure you in." Maggie felt a chill run down her spine. "The forest," she echoed. "It's alive?" The man nodded, stepping closer to her. alive in ways you can't begin to understand. It's ancient, older than anything in this world, and it feeds on people like you, those who've suffered loss, those who carry guilt. It shows you what you want to see, what you fear to lose. And once it has you, he trailed off, his expression darkening. Maggie's hands clenched into fists as she fought back tears. "I just want to go home," she said, her voice breaking. "I didn't mean to come here. I don't even know how I got here. Please, can you help me?" The man sighed, glancing at the glowing lantern. "Getting out isn't easy," he said. "The forest doesn't let go of its prey willingly. But if you're strong enough, if you can resist its temptations, you might stand a chance." Maggie's heart sank at the word might. "What do I have to do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He gestured to the circle of symbols on the ground. "This is a binding circle," he explained. "It's meant to hold back the forest's influence, to give you a moment of clarity. But it won't last forever. If you want to leave, you'll have to confront whatever it is that brought you here." Maggie's stomach churned at the thought. "I don't understand," she said. "What do you mean, confront it?" The man's gaze hardened. "The forest thrives on your guilt, your regrets. It's been using them to trap you. If you want to escape, you'll have to face the things you've been running from, the things you've been too afraid to admit, even to yourself." Maggie shook her head, her throat tightening. "I don't know if I can do that," she whispered. "I've already lost so much." The man placed a hand on her shoulder, his grip firm but not unkind. "You don't have a choice," he said. "If you don't face it, the forest will keep you here forever. And trust me, that's a fate worse than death." Maggie swallowed hard, her mind racing. She thought of Emma and Luke, of their distorted faces and accusing voices. She thought of the whispers, the shadows, the unrelenting darkness. Was this really the only way out? Before she could respond, the man stepped back, his expression grim. "I can't stay with you," he said. "The forest doesn't like my kind. We're not welcome here. But I'll give you this." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small, weathered book, its cover marked with the same strange symbols as the circle. "It's a guide," he explained, pressing it into her hands. "It won't make the journey easy, but it'll help you understand what you're dealing with." Maggie clutched the book tightly, her fingers trembling. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely audible. The man nodded, his expression softening. "Good luck," he said. "You're going to need it." With that, he turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving Maggie alone once more. She looked down at the book in her hands, her heart pounding. The lantern's light flickered, casting her shadow across the circle, and for the first time, she felt truly afraid of what lay ahead. Maggie stared at the worn book in her hands, its leather cover rough and cracked under her trembling fingers. The symbols etched into its surface seemed to writhe and shift in the flickering lantern light, making her feel dizzy. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to open it despite the growing pit of dread in her stomach. The pages were yellowed and brittle, filled with cramped handwriting and intricate diagrams that looked more like arcane scribbles than anything comprehensible. She scanned the first page, her eyes catching on a passage written in bold, jagged letters. "The forest feeds on your fear and grief. It shows you what you cannot have and demands what you will not give. To escape, you must face your truth and make a choice. Surrender to the forest or take back what is yours." The words sent a shiver down her spine. Maggie flipped through the pages, finding more warnings, descriptions of strange rituals, and lists of items she had never heard of. The diagrams of twisted trees and shadowy figures mirrored the horrors she had already encountered, but none of it gave her a clear direction. "I can't do this," she whispered, her voice trembling. She glanced at the lantern, its flame flickering weakly. "I don't even know where to start." As if in response to her despair, the forest around her began to stir. The branches overhead groaned and twisted, and a faint, chilling wind swept through the clearing. It carried a sound, a soft, haunting melody that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. It was a lullaby. Her heart stopped. It was the same lullaby she had sung to Emma and Luke every night when they were little. The sound was faint, as if carried from a great distance, but it was unmistakable. Her chest tightened as tears welled up in her eyes. "No," she murmured, shaking her head. "This isn't real. You're not real." The lullaby grew louder, wrapping around her like a ghostly embrace. Her legs moved on their own, carrying her toward the sound. She clutched the book tightly, her knuckles white, as she stumbled through the dense forest. The trees seemed to part before her, creating a narrow path illuminated by the faint glow of the lantern she had left behind. Ahead, the melody grew clearer, accompanied by the faint sound of children's laughter. Maggie's breath caught in her throat as she emerged into a small clearing. The sight before her made her knees buckle. Emma and Luke stood in the center of the clearing, their backs to her. They were holding hands, their small figures bathed in an ethereal light that seemed to emanate from nowhere. They looked exactly as she remembered them, their hair tousled from play, their clothes slightly rumpled. "Emma? Luke?" she called out, her voice breaking. The children turned to face her, their expressions eerily blank. For a moment, Maggie's heart soared with hope, but it was quickly crushed by the sight of their eyes. They were not the warm, lively eyes of her children, but cold, dark voids that seemed to suck the light from the clearing. "You came back," Emma said, her voice devoid of emotion. "Did you miss us, Mommy?" Luke added, tilting his head slightly. Maggie took a step back, her hands trembling. "You're not real," she whispered. "You can't be real." Emma took a step forward, her bare feet silent against the forest floor. "We're as real as you made us," she said, her tone accusing. "You wanted us back, didn't you? You begged for us." Maggie's tears spilled over as she shook her head. "I didn't know it would be like this," she sobbed. "I just wanted my babies back. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." Luke's expression twisted into something cruel, his small face contorting unnaturally. "You didn't mean for it to happen," he mocked, his voice echoing unnervingly. "But it did, and now you're here." The forest seemed to close in around her, the shadows deepening as the air grew colder. Maggie clutched the book to her chest, her mind racing. She knew she couldn't trust what she was seeing, but the sight of her children, twisted as they were, was more than she could bear. "Why are you doing this to me?" she cried. "What do you want from me?" Emma and Luke exchanged a glance before stepping closer, their movements slow and deliberate. "We want you to stay," Emma said softly. "Forever." Maggie backed away, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "No," she said, shaking her head. "I can't stay. I have to leave. I have to get out of here." Luke's laughter rang out, high-pitched and mocking. "You can't leave, Mommy. The forest won't let you." Maggie's fingers tightened around the book, its rough edges digging into her skin. She glanced down at its pages, searching desperately for something, anything, that could help her. Her eyes landed on a passage written in bold letters. "The forest will use what you love most to trap you. Do not listen. Do not believe. Remember, what is taken cannot be returned." She looked up at the children, her heart breaking. "You're not my kids," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "You're something else. Something the forest created to torment me." Emma's expression darkened, her mouth twisting into a snarl. "We're your children," she hissed, "and you'll never leave us." Maggie took a step back, the book clutched tightly in her hands. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I'm so sorry, but I can't stay." The clearing began to shift, the ground beneath her feet rippling like water. The children's forms flickered, their faces distorting as they advanced on her. Maggie's pulse pounded in her ears as she turned and ran, the sound of their laughter chasing her into the darkness. Maggie's feet pounded against the uneven ground as she ran, the forest blurring around her in a haze of darkness and panic. The children's laughter echoed behind her, growing louder and more distorted with every step. It wasn't the sweet sound she remembered from years ago. It was something jagged and inhuman, like the scrape of nails on glass. She clutched the book against her chest, her mind racing. The passage she had read repeated in her head like a mantra. The forest will use what you love most to trap you. Do not listen. Do not believe. But how could she not believe? They had looked like her children. They had spoken like them, even if their words were twisted. Stop running, Mommy. Luke's voice called out, unnervingly close. You can't escape us. Maggie didn't dare look back. Her lungs burned. Her legs screamed in protest, but she pushed herself forward, desperate to put distance between her and whatever was chasing her. The trees seemed to shift and twist, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands to block her path. She ducked and weaved, her heart hammering in her chest. Suddenly, the ground gave way beneath her. Maggie let out a startled cry as she tumbled down a steep embankment, her body crashing through undergrowth and rocks. The world spun around her until she landed hard at the bottom, the impact knocking the wind out of her. She lay there for a moment, gasping for air, the book still clutched tightly in her hands. Above her, the laughter faded, replaced by an eerie silence. Maggie struggled to her feet, her body aching from the fall. She was in another clearing, this one much smaller and more enclosed. The air here felt heavy, oppressive, as if the forest itself was watching her. The book slipped from her grasp and landed open on the ground. Maggie bent to pick it up, but froze when she saw the page it had fallen to. The writing on it was different, bolder, almost as if it had been written in anger. The words seemed to pulse with a faint, malevolent glow. The forest is alive. It knows your secrets, your pain. To leave, you must confront it. Face the heart of the forest, where the truth lies buried. Only then can you break free. Maggie's breath hitched. She didn't know where the heart of the forest was, but she had a sinking feeling it wasn't far. She looked around the clearing, her eyes darting from shadow to shadow. The trees here were gnarled and ancient, their bark twisted into shapes that almost resembled faces. The ground was soft and damp, and the air smelled of decay. A faint sound reached her ears, a low, rhythmic thumping, like the beat of a massive heart. It seemed to come from deep within the forest, pulling at her like an invisible thread. Maggie's hands trembled as she picked up the book and hugged it to her chest. I have to do this, she whispered to herself. I have to finish this. For Emma. For Luke. She started toward the sound, her steps hesitant but determined. The forest seemed to grow darker with each step she took, the shadows deepening until it felt like she was walking through a tunnel. The thumping grew louder, more insistent, vibrating through her chest. Maggie's pulse quickened, matching its rhythm. The path narrowed, forcing her to squeeze between trees that seemed to close in around her. The air grew colder, each breath visible as a puff of white in the darkness. She tried to focus on the sound, using it as a guide, but her mind kept drifting back to the children's distorted faces and their chilling words. After what felt like hours, Maggie emerged into another clearing. This one was unlike anything she had seen before. The ground was covered in a thick carpet of moss, and in the center stood a massive tree, its trunk so wide it seemed to swallow the clearing. The tree's bark was black and glistening, its branches stretching high into the sky like the arms of a great, ancient beast. At its base, the ground pulsed faintly, as if the very earth was alive. Maggie took a hesitant step forward, the book clutched tightly in her hands. The air here was thick with tension, each breath feeling like a struggle. She could feel the weight of the forest pressing down on her, its presence more tangible than ever. "Is this it?" she murmured. "The heart of the forest?" The thumping was deafening now, reverberating through her entire body. Maggie approached the tree cautiously, her eyes fixed on the ground beneath it. There, in the mossy soil, was a shallow depression, its edges marked with the same strange symbols she had seen earlier. As she drew closer, the ground began to shift. The depression deepened, the symbols glowing faintly, and from its center rose a figure. Maggie stumbled back, her heart pounding as she watched the figure take shape. It was Emma and Luke, or something that looked like them. Their forms were twisted and incomplete, their faces a grotesque mockery of what they once were. Their eyes were black voids, their mouths stretched into unnatural grins. "You came," the figure said, its voice a distorted blend of her children's. "We knew you would." Maggie's knees buckled, and she fell to the ground. "What do you want from me?" she cried, tears streaming down her face. "Why won't you leave me alone?" The figure tilted its head, its grin widening. "Because you brought us here," it said. "You made us. We are your guilt, your sorrow, your pain, and we are never letting you go." Maggie sat frozen, the figure's twisted words piercing her like daggers. The thing standing before her, the amalgamation of Emma and Luke, grotesque and alien, radiated an unbearable presence. Its void-like eyes bore into hers, stripping her of any defenses she thought she had. "No," she whispered, shaking her head, her voice trembling. "I didn't make you. You're a lie. You're not my children." The figure's grin faltered for a moment, but then it laughed, a horrible, guttural sound that echoed through the clearing. "You can lie to yourself all you want, Mommy," it said, its tone mockingly sweet. "But you can't lie to us. We are your children, or what's left of them, after you let them go." Maggie flinched as though struck. The accusation cut deep, dredging up memories she had tried so hard to bury. The car accident, the moments of silence before the screaming, the rain-soaked road. It all came rushing back in a tidal wave of pain. "I didn't let you go," she cried, her voice cracking. "I fought for you. I tried to save you." The figure stepped closer, the ground beneath its feet writhing as if alive. "But you couldn't," it hissed. "You weren't strong enough. And now you're here, trying to bring us back. You couldn't let us rest." Maggie felt her strength crumble. She dropped the book onto the mossy ground, her hands shaking too violently to hold it. "I just wanted to see you again," she whispered. I didn't know this would happen." The figure tilted its head, studying her. For a moment, there was a flicker of something familiar in its expression, a softness, a memory of the children she had loved so dearly. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the same cruel smile. "You wanted us back," it said, "so now we're here. But you'll never have us the way you want. Not unless you do what the forest demands." "What does it want from me?" Maggie asked, her voice barely audible. She felt as though the weight of the forest was crushing her, pressing her into the earth. "What can I do?" The figure didn't answer immediately. Instead, it raised one twisted hand and pointed toward the massive tree at the center of the clearing. Maggie followed its gesture and saw something she hadn't noticed before, a faint outline of a door carved into the tree's trunk. It was marked with symbols similar to the ones in the book, and it pulsed faintly, in time with the deafening thump of the forest's heartbeat. "To take back what you lost," the figure said, "you must give something in return. Something the forest wants." Maggie stared at the door, her mind racing. What does it want?" she asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. The figure's grin widened, its teeth sharp and glinting in the faint light. "It wants you, Mommy. It wants all of you. The word sent a chill down Maggie's spine. She backed away, shaking her head. "No," she said, her voice trembling. "I can't. I won't." "Then you'll never leave," the figure said simply. "And neither will we. We'll stay here, trapped in the forest, forever." Maggie's heart sank. The forest was toying with her, manipulating her love for her children and her guilt over their deaths. It was offering her a cruel choice: give herself to the forest completely, or remain trapped in this nightmare, tormented by the twisted echoes of Emma and Luke. Tears streamed down her face as she weighed her options. Could she sacrifice herself to save them, even if they weren't truly her children? Could she trust the forest to keep its word? She glanced down at the book lying on the ground, its pages fluttering in the breeze. One passage caught her eye, the words bold and stark against the yellowed paper. "The forest will offer you lies. Do not believe them. The only way out is through the truth. The truth." Maggie wiped her tears, her resolve hardening. She didn't know if she could trust the forest, but she couldn't keep running. She had to face it head on, no matter the cost. She picked up the book and turned to the figure, her hands steady despite the fear coursing through her. "You're not my children," she said firmly. "You're something this forest created to punish me. But I won't let you control me anymore." The figure hissed, its grin fading into a snarl. "You think you're strong enough to defy the forest," it spat. "You'll never leave here alive." Maggie didn't respond. She turned toward the massive tree, clutching the book tightly, and began to walk toward the carved door. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the forest itself was trying to hold her back. The thumping grew louder, shaking the ground beneath her feet, but she forced herself forward. When she reached the door, she placed a trembling hand on its surface. The bark was cold and smooth, pulsing faintly under her touch. She took a deep breath and opened the book, scanning its pages for any clue about what to do next. Her eyes landed on a ritual described in detail, a series of words she didn't recognize, accompanied by a diagram of the symbols she had seen throughout the forest. It was a summoning, an invocation to confront the heart of the forest directly. Maggie hesitated, the weight of her decision pressing down on her. But there was no turning back now. With a deep breath, she began to recite the words aloud, her voice shaking but growing stronger with each syllable. The forest reacted immediately. The ground trembled, the trees groaned, and the air grew impossibly cold. The door beneath her hand began to glow, its symbols flaring to life. A deafening roar filled the clearing, as if the forest itself was screaming in rage. Maggie closed her eyes and kept chanting, pouring every ounce of her will into the words. She could feel the forest pushing back, trying to silence her, but she refused to stop. She had come too far to give up now. Finally, the door creaked open, revealing a swirling void of darkness. Maggie stared into it, her heart pounding. She didn't know what lay on the other side, but she knew it was the only way to end this nightmare. Taking one last deep breath, she stepped through the door and into the unknown. Maggie plunged into the void, the world around her dissolving into utter darkness. For a moment, it felt as though she were falling, her body weightless and untethered. The air was thick and suffocating, pressing in from all sides as a deafening silence filled her ears. Then, without warning, she landed hard on solid ground. She gasped for breath, her lungs burning as though she had been underwater. When she opened her eyes, she found herself standing in a strange, surreal landscape. The sky above her was an inky black, streaked with pulsating red veins that moved like living things. The ground beneath her feet was soft and spongy, pulsating in time with the now familiar thumping heartbeat of the forest. Maggie turned slowly, taking in her surroundings. She was in another clearing, but this one was otherworldly. impossibly vast and bordered by towering trees that seemed to stretch endlessly into the darkness. At the center of the clearing stood a massive, grotesque structure, a tree-like heart, its surface slick and pulsating, with thick, black roots snaking outward in every direction. The roots quivered and writhed, as though sensing her presence. As Maggie approached the heart, she noticed something else. Figures were embedded in the roots, their faces twisted in agony. Some were fully encased, their forms barely recognizable, while others were partially free, their mouths open in silent screams. Maggie's stomach churned at the sight. A voice echoed through the clearing, deep and resonant, seeming to come from the heart itself. "You have come, bearer of sorrow," it intoned. "You seek to defy me, to challenge what cannot be undone." Maggie's knees nearly gave out, but she forced herself to stand tall. "I'm not here to challenge you," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "I'm here to end this. Whatever you are, whatever this place is, I won't let it control me anymore." The heart pulsed, the ground beneath her trembling in response. "You speak of ending, yet you do not understand. You are already mine, as are all who wander into my domain. You brought yourself here, drawn by the weight of your grief. And now, you will remain." "No," Maggie said firmly. "You're wrong. I made mistakes, I carry guilt, but I refuse to let you feed on it anymore." The heart let out a low, guttural laugh that shook the air. "Brave words, but words are hollow. Prove your resolve, then. Confront the truth you buried long ago." Before Maggie could respond, the ground beneath her shifted violently. She stumbled, clutching the book to her chest as the earth split open in front of her. From the chasm rose two figures, Emma and Luke. But they were not the grotesque creatures she had seen before. They looked exactly as they had the last time she saw them alive. "Mommy," Emma's small voice called out, trembling with fear. She held Luke's hand tightly, her wide eyes searching Maggie's face. "What's happening? Where are we?" Maggie's breath caught in her throat. They looked so real, so alive. She wanted to run to them, to hold them, but something held her back. She could feel the forest's influence, its manipulation at work. "It's not them," she whispered to herself, closing her eyes. "It's not real. But we are real," Luke said, his voice breaking. "Mommy, why won't you help us? Don't you love us anymore?" The words hit Maggie like a physical blow. She opened her eyes, tears streaming down her face. "I do love you," she said, her voice cracking. "More than anything in this world. But you're not my children. You're something the forest created to torment me." Emma's face crumpled, and she began to sob. "How can you say that?" she cried. "We're right here. Please, Mommy, don't leave us." Maggie's hands trembled, her resolve wavering. The sight of her children crying, begging for her, was almost too much to bear. But then she remembered the book's warning. The forest will use what you love most to trap you. Do not listen. Do not believe. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice steadying. "I love you, but I can't give in to this. I won't let the forest win." The figures of Emma and Luke froze, their sobs cutting off abruptly. Their eyes darkened, their expressions twisting into something cold and hateful. "You can't leave us," Emma shrieked, her voice morphing into a deep, guttural growl. "You belong here, with us." The figures lunged toward her, their forms shifting and distorting. Maggie stumbled back, clutching the book tightly. The symbols on its cover began to glow faintly, as if responding to her determination. Without thinking, she opened the book and began to read aloud. The words were foreign, their meanings incomprehensible, but they resonated with power. As she spoke, the clearing around her began to change. The figures of Emma and Luke screamed, their forms unraveling like smoke caught in a strong wind. The roots of the heart writhed violently, and the thumping heartbeat grew erratic. "Enough," The voice of the forest roared, shaking the ground. You cannot destroy me. I am eternal. I am the pain you cannot escape. Maggie didn't stop. She kept reading, her voice rising over the forest's protests. The book seemed to guide her, the words flowing from her lips with increasing strength. The grotesque heart began to crack, dark fluid oozing from its surface. As the final word left her mouth, the heart let out an ear-splitting scream. The clearing erupted in a blinding light, and Maggie felt herself being pulled upward, away from the darkness. The last thing she saw before everything went white was the heart shattering into countless pieces, its black roots shriveling into nothingness. When the blinding light faded, Maggie found herself lying on the ground. The air was cool and still, carrying the faint scent of pine and earth. She blinked, disoriented, and slowly sat up. The forest around her was quiet, eerily so, but it no longer felt oppressive or alive. The sinister presence that had haunted her every step was gone. She looked down at the book in her hands. Its pages were blank. The symbols and text that had once filled them vanished as if they had never existed. The cover was cracked, and when she touched it, it crumbled into ash, slipping through her fingers. Maggie rose unsteadily to her feet, her body aching from the ordeal. The sky above was a pale gray, a stark contrast to the otherworldly red and black she had seen moments ago. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, she could see the horizon beyond the trees. "Am I free?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. Her mind raced, replaying everything she had endured. The distorted figures of her children, the pulsing heart of the forest, the choice it had forced upon her. It all felt like a horrible dream, yet the ache in her chest told her it was real. She had confronted the truth and survived, but the victory felt hollow. As Maggie began to walk, she noticed the forest thinning with every step. The dense canopy above gave way to open sky, and the twisted trees transformed into familiar oaks and pines. Relief washed over her as she recognized the trail leading back to her car. The sight of her car, still parked at the trailhead, brought tears to her eyes. She broke into a run, her legs shaky but determined, and reached the driver's side door. She fumbled with the keys, her hands trembling, and slid into the seat. For a moment, she just sat there, gripping the steering wheel and letting the silence surround her. But the silence wasn't empty. As she started the engine, a faint sound caught her attention, a soft giggle like a child's laughter. Her heart froze, and she whipped her head around, scanning the forest. There was nothing there. No movement, no figures. Just the trees, still and indifferent. "It's over," she told herself firmly, gripping the wheel tighter. "It's over." She pulled onto the road, the tires crunching on gravel, and headed toward home. But as the miles passed, the feeling of unease lingered. She couldn't shake the memory of her children's voices, their faces, so real, so vivid. Were they truly gone, or had the forest left a piece of them behind? When Maggie reached her house, the sun was setting, casting a warm orange glow over the neighborhood. She stepped inside, locking the door behind her, and let out a shaky breath. The familiar sights and smells of home brought her some comfort, though the weight of her experience still hung heavy in the air. She wandered into the living room and froze. On the coffee table sat two objects that hadn't been there before. A small, stuffed bear and a toy car. They were worn and faded, but unmistakable. Emma's bear and Luke's favorite car, the ones they had been holding the day of the accident. Maggie's hands began to shake. She approached the table slowly, her breath catching in her throat. As she reached out to touch the toys, a faint voice echoed through the room. "Mommy?" Her blood ran cold. She turned sharply, her heart pounding, but the room was empty. The shadows seemed to deepen, stretching across the walls like grasping hands. Her eyes darted around, searching for the source of the voice, but there was nothing. Just the suffocating stillness of the house. Another voice joined the first, this one softer but unmistakable. "Why did you leave us?" Maggie stumbled back, clutching her chest. "No," she whispered. "You're not real. You're not real." The giggles returned, louder this time, echoing from the hallway. The temperature in the room dropped sharply, and Maggie could see her breath misting in the air. She turned toward the hallway, her heart hammering in her chest. At the end of the hallway stood two figures, their silhouettes small and familiar. Emma and Luke. They stood hand in hand, their faces obscured by shadows, but she could feel their eyes on her. "Mommy," Emma said, her voice soft and pleading. "Don't you love us anymore?" Maggie's knees buckled, and she sank to the floor. Tears streamed down her face as she stared at the figures. "I do," she whispered. "I love you more than anything. Then why won't you stay with us?" Luke asked, his voice tinged with sadness. "We miss you, Mommy." Maggie shook her head, her mind racing. The forest was gone. She had destroyed it, hadn't she? But the children, these echoes, these remnants, still lingered. Were they part of the forest's curse, or something else entirely? "I can't," she said, her voice breaking. "I can't stay with you. You're gone. You're not real." The figures stepped closer, the shadows peeling away to reveal their faces. They looked just as they had before the accident, innocent, beautiful, and heartbreakingly real. "Are you sure?" Emma asked, tilting her head. Her smile was warm but unsettling, as if it didn't quite belong. "Maybe you're the one who's not real, Mommy." The words sent a chill down Maggie's spine. The room began to spin, the walls closing in as the children's laughter filled the air. She clutched her head, her vision blurring, and screamed. Maggie's scream shattered the silence, but it was swallowed by the oppressive laughter of the figures in front of her. Emma and Luke stepped forward again, their faces still locked in those impossibly familiar smiles, their eyes blackened and deep, as if they were staring into a place where light couldn't reach. "Mommy," Emma whispered again, her voice growing in intensity, pressing in on Maggie's chest like a vice. "We want you to stay with us forever. You can't leave us." Maggie felt the walls of the house bend and sway, as though they were alive, suffocating her in their pressure. She pressed her palms to her ears, trying to block out the voices, but they only grew louder. Her breathing became shallow, her vision narrowing. She couldn't think, couldn't breathe. "This isn't real," she reminded herself. "This isn't real. They're gone. They're gone, and I'm free. I defeated the forest. I broke its curse." But even as she repeated these words, doubt gnawed at her. The memories of her children, their faces and voices, were so vivid. How could she know for sure what was real anymore? Had the forest truly been destroyed, or had it simply retreated, waiting for the right moment to return, to take her again? The children's figures advanced, their movements jerky, unnatural, like marionettes pulled by invisible strings. The shadows around them grew longer, stretching along the floor like tendrils. They reached toward Maggie, winding up her legs, tugging at her arms. "You can't escape us," Luke said, his voice now a low, resonating hum, echoing in every corner of the room. "We are part of you. You can never leave." "Leave us, Mommy," Emma added, her voice high-pitched and sharp, the sweetness now twisted with an underlying malice. "Why won't you stay? You belong with us." Maggie's chest tightened, the panic rising. Her head spun as she looked from one child to the other. The room was growing colder, the shadows darker, and she could feel the walls pressing in on her from all sides. "No," Maggie gasped, her voice trembling. "I won't stay. I won't let you control me anymore. You're not my children. You're just echoes of them, created by the forest. I broke the curse." For a moment there was silence. The figures stopped moving, their eyes fixed on her, studying her. A cold breeze swept through the room, but it wasn't comforting. It felt like the last breath of something dying. Emma and Luke's smiles faltered, their faces twisting, their eyes darkening further. The forest can never be fully destroyed, they whispered in unison, their voices growing distorted, like an old, broken record. It will always find a way to return. Maggie staggered backward, fear surging through her like electricity. The shadows around the children began to writhe, growing more animated, coiling up their limbs, twisting around their bodies, turning into dark, grotesque shapes. "You're wrong," Maggie whispered, her voice shaking with determination. "I'm not going back there. I won't let you take me." The figures of her children continued to advance, their movements unnervingly fluid and unnatural. Their eyes were now pools of black ink, the light in them completely gone, leaving nothing but emptiness. The shadows grew longer, casting the room into an even darker abyss. With one last desperate breath, Maggie reached into her pocket, where she had hidden the silver locket, Emma's and Luke's locket, the one she had kept close since the accident. She gripped it tightly, the cold metal digging into her palm, and closed her eyes. "I won't let you win," she said fiercely. "Not like this." The locket in her hand began to vibrate, humming softly, and Maggie felt a warmth radiate from it, slowly pushing away the encroaching darkness. The room seemed to shift, as if reality itself was beginning to bend. The shadows around the children recoiled, hissing and writhing, unable to get any closer. "No!" The figures of her children screamed, their voices breaking, losing the unnatural, echoing resonance. Their forms began to flicker, like a broken projection. "You can't leave us. You can't fight us." But Maggie didn't falter. She held the locket tighter, her voice rising as she spoke the words she had never dared to speak aloud before. "I forgive myself." The moment the words left her mouth, the figures of Emma and Luke screamed in agony, their faces distorting into grotesque masks of pain. The room trembled violently, the shadows clawing at the edges of the walls, but the light from the locket held steady, pushing back the darkness, forcing it to recede. The figures began to dissolve, their forms twisting into vapor, disappearing into the air like smoke. Emma's anguished cry echoed in the fading room, and Luke's voice faltered, becoming a mere whisper. "Mommy, please." And then, as quickly as it had begun, everything fell silent. The shadows vanished, and the room returned to its normal state, familiar, safe, and quiet. The oppressive weight that had suffocated her lifted, and Maggie was left standing alone in the now empty hallway. She was still trembling, her chest heaving with the remnants of panic, but the air around her felt lighter, brighter. She took a cautious step forward, glancing back at the coffee table where the toys had once been. They were gone. The house felt empty, but not in the way it had before. There was no longer a looming presence, no darkness lingering at the edges of her vision. Maggie closed her eyes for a moment, gathering her strength. She could feel the warmth of the locket still pulsing in her hand. She felt a strange peace within herself, a peace that had been absent for so long. She had faced her guilt, her fear, and the twisted remnants of the past. And for the first time in years, she felt the weight of loss lift from her shoulders. The nightmare was over. Maggie stood there, her breath gradually slowing as the eerie calm of the house enveloped her. For a moment, she considered sinking to her knees, letting the weight of it all overwhelm her. But she didn't. She had faced the darkness, confronted the guilt that had haunted her, and now she could finally let go. The locket in her hand was warm, its presence a reminder of everything she had lost, and everything she had survived. She tucked it safely into her pocket and walked slowly through the house, her footsteps echoing softly in the stillness. She passed the photographs that lined the hallway, the smiling faces of Emma and Luke frozen in time, their eyes forever young. They were gone, but not forgotten. She entered the kitchen, where sunlight streamed through the window, casting soft patterns across the counter. The world outside seemed so ordinary, so untouched by the horrors she had experienced. She reached for the kettle, her hands steady now, her mind clearing with each passing second. She poured herself a cup of tea, the warm liquid soothing her raw nerves. As she took a sip, a strange thought crossed her mind. Had the forest truly been destroyed, or had it simply retreated, waiting for another chance to strike? But she dismissed it almost immediately. No, she had broken its hold. She had fought back against the darkness, and she had won. The phone rang, its shrill tone snapping her from her thoughts. Maggie's heart skipped a beat as she reached for it, wondering if perhaps this was another twisted hallucination. But when she saw the caller ID, her breath caught in her throat. It was Dr. Harris, the therapist she had seen before the accident. She had avoided him for years, unable to face the guilt and grief that had consumed her. But now, as she stared at the phone, she felt a strange sense of peace. She answered it, her voice shaky at first. "Hello, Maggie." Dr. Harris's voice was warm and familiar, yet tinged with concern. "I've been trying to reach you. How are you?" Maggie closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the question settle on her. She hadn't spoken to him since the accident, hadn't spoken to anyone. The isolation, the grief, it had all felt too much to bear. But now, for the first time in years, she could breathe. She could think clearly. I'm okay," she said, her voice steadier now. "I think I'm okay." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Dr. Harris's voice softened. "Maggie, I'm glad to hear that. You've been through so much. I know it's been hard to move forward, but if you're ready, I'd like to help you work through what happened. We can start wherever you feel comfortable." Maggie closed her eyes again, a deep sigh escaping her lips. The journey had been long and painful. She had lost so much, but she had also survived. She had faced the darkness and come out on the other side. There was still healing to be done, but for the first time, it felt possible. She wasn't sure what the future would bring, but she was ready to take the next step. "I think I'm ready," she said softly, her voice filled with a quiet strength. "I think I'm ready to move forward." The sound of Dr. Harris's voice was reassuring, but it was the warmth of her own resolve that made Maggie realize how far she had come. The forest was no longer a threat. The guilt, the fear, the haunting memories, they had lost their power over her. As she sat at the kitchen table, the world outside seemed to shift. The sunlight was brighter, the air fresher, and the sounds of the world around her, birds singing, the wind rustling through the trees, felt real again. For the first time in a long while, she felt the weight of the past lift, and the future felt full of possibility. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living. And as she looked out the window, watching the last remnants of daylight fade into the evening, Maggie finally felt a sense of peace she hadn't thought possible. The nightmares were over, and the world, once dark and oppressive, had become a place of light again. It was time to move forward, and this time she would do it on her own terms.